When a racist cop arrests an innocent 8-year-old black girl, he thinks his abuse of power will go unnoticed. But her father, a fearless judge, doesn't just fight back. He delivers justice so brutal and unforgettable that it exposes the ugliness of racism for everyone to see. The sun had barely risen over the quiet streets of Willow Creek, a small suburban town that prided itself on its charm and order. 8-year-old Aaliyah Carter, a bright and kind-hearted girl with big dreams of becoming a doctor, skipped happily down the sidewalk, clutching her new backpack. It was her first week at summer science camp, and she couldn't wait to show her teacher the tiny stethoscope her father had bought her as a gift. Father, Judge Malcolm Carter, was the town's first black judge, a man known for his unshakable sense of justice. Malcolm had raised Aaliyah to believe in fairness and kindness, teaching her that no matter how unfair the world seemed, good people could make a difference. Aaliyah looked up to her father with awe, calling him her hero. That morning, as Malcolm kissed her goodbye at the bus stop, he smiled at her excited chatter about the camp's experiments. "Remember, sweetheart," he said, kneeling down to look her in the eye. "You're smart, you're brave, and no matter what happens, you can always come to me." "Okay, Daddy," she giggled, giving him a big hug before climbing onto the bus. But as Malcolm watched the bus disappear down the street, a knot formed in his stomach. It was the same unease he felt every time Aaliyah left his sight in a world that didn't always see her innocence the way he did. Later that afternoon, Aaliyah was walking home from the bus stop, the stethoscope still around her neck. Her mind buzzed with excitement as she replayed the day's experiments. But her joy was interrupted when she heard the sharp screech of car brakes behind her. She froze, turning to see a police car pull up. The officer, Deputy Johnson, stepped out, his face twisted into a sneer. "Hey you! What are you doing around here?" he barked. Aaliyah blinked, confused. "I'm walking home, sir," she said softly, her voice trembling. Johnson's eyes narrowed, and he glanced at her backpack. "What's in there? You stealing something?" Her heart raced as she clutched her bag tightly. "No, sir. It's just my school stuff," she said, tears welling in her eyes. But Johnson didn't care. To him, Aaliyah wasn't an innocent child. She was just another black face in the wrong neighborhood. "Don't lie to me," he spat, grabbing her backpack and yanking it open. Books, papers, and her prized stethoscope tumbled to the ground. "Stop! That's mine!" she cried, reaching for her things. But Johnson shoved her back. "Don't move!" he barked. Neighbors began to gather, watching in silent horror as the officer handcuffed the terrified child. "You're coming with me," he sneered, dragging her toward the car. "Please, I didn't do anything," Aaliyah sobbed, but her cries fell on deaf ears. As Johnson shoved her into the back seat, a woman filming on her phone whispered to another bystander, "That's Judge Carter's daughter. He's not going to let this slide." Back at home, Malcolm was reviewing court briefs in his study when his phone buzzed. It was a frantic call from a neighbor. "Judge Carter, you need to get down to the station," the woman said, her voice shaking. "Aaliyah's been arrested." For a moment, Malcolm couldn't speak. The words didn't make sense. Arrested. His Aaliyah. His heart pounded as the neighbor explained the situation, her voice breaking with emotion. Malcolm's hand tightened around his phone. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice cold with controlled fury. As he grabbed his keys and headed out the door, one thought consumed him. No one touches my daughter. No one. Malcolm Carter's car sped through the streets of Willow Creek, his mind racing faster than the engine. Aaliyah's laughter, her dreams, her innocence, all of it flashed before his eyes. The thought of his little girl being handcuffed, humiliated, and treated like a criminal was too much to bear. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter with every mile as anger and heartbreak swirled in his chest. When he arrived at the police station, the sight of the imposing brick building sent a chill down his spine. The same building where he had walked in countless times as a respected judge now felt like enemy territory. Malcolm took a deep breath, his jaw clenched as he stepped inside. The front desk officer looked up, her bored expression shifting to unease when she recognized him. "Judge Carter, what can I—" "Where's my daughter?" Malcolm cut her off, his voice sharp and unwavering. The officer stammered. I think—" "Where is she?" he demanded, his booming voice echoing through the lobby. Heads turned, and an eerie silence fell over the room. Deputy Johnson appeared from a hallway, looking smug until his eyes landed on Malcolm. His arrogance faltered for a split second before he plastered on a fake confidence. "Judge Carter, what brings you—" Malcolm stepped forward, his piercing gaze cutting through the officer like a blade. "You know exactly why I'm here," he growled. "You arrested an 8-year-old girl, my daughter. What on earth were you thinking?" Johnson shrugged, trying to maintain his composure. "She was acting suspicious. I had every right." "Suspicious?" Malcolm roared, his voice filled with disbelief and fury. "She's a child, walking home from school with a backpack. You looked at her and the only thing you saw was the color of her skin." The room fell into a tense silence. Officers exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to react. Johnson, however, smirked and leaned back, crossing his arms. "Judge or not, everyone's treated the same here," he said dismissively. Malcolm took a step closer, his voice dropping to a chilling calm. "You think this is equality? Handcuffing and traumatizing an innocent little girl? Is that your version of justice?" Johnson's confidence wavered, but he forced a chuckle. "She resisted, sir. I had no choice." At that moment, the door to the back room creaked open, and Aaliyah emerged, escorted by a young officer who looked visibly uncomfortable. Her tear-streaked face and trembling hands were like a knife to Malcolm's heart. "Daddy!" she cried, running to him. Malcolm dropped to his knees and wrapped her in his arms. "It's okay, baby. I'm here. You're safe now," he whispered, fighting back the lump in his throat. As he held her, he looked over her shoulder at Johnson, his eyes blazing. "This isn't over," he said firmly. Later, in the car ride home, Aaliyah sat quietly in the back seat, clutching her stethoscope tightly. Malcolm glanced at her in the rearview mirror, guilt and pain washing over him. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked softly. She nodded but didn't meet his eyes. "Daddy, why did that man think I did something bad?" she asked, her voice small and broken. Malcolm's grip on the steering wheel tightened. How could he explain to an 8-year-old the poison of racism? How could he tell her that some people would never see her as innocent, no matter how kind or good she was? He took a deep breath. "Sometimes people don't see the real you," he said gently. "They see what they want to see. And sometimes that's not fair. But listen to me, Aaliyah. You are smart, brave, and good. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're anything less." She looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with a mix of fear and confusion. "What's going to happen to that man?" she asked. Malcolm's gaze hardened. "I'm going to make sure he's held accountable," he said, his voice steady. "I promise you, Aaliyah, no one gets to treat you like that," and walk away. By the time they reached home, Malcolm had already begun planning his next move. He wasn't just Aaliyah's father. He was a judge, a man who knew the law inside and out. He wouldn't let Johnson's actions be swept under the rug. Malcolm knew this wasn't just about his daughter. It was about every child, every family, and every person who had ever been wrongfully targeted because of the color of their skin. As Aaliyah drifted off to sleep that night, Malcolm sat in his study, poring over legal documents and drafting formal complaints. He reached out to a journalist friend, sharing the video footage recorded by the neighbor at the scene. "This isn't just a case," he told his friend. "It's a battle against a system that thinks it can get away with this. I won't let it." The journalist nodded. "We'll expose it, Malcolm. The world needs to see this." Malcolm's resolve hardened. This was just the beginning. The next morning, the story broke wide open. Local news outlets ran the headline, "8-year-old black girl arrested by Officer Johnson. Judge Carter speaks out." Clips of the arrest, filmed by witnesses, flooded social media, sparking outrage across the town. The video showed Aaliyah sobbing as Officer Johnson dragged her to the patrol car, his face twisted in smug disdain. The footage went viral. Comments poured in from all over the country, some furious, some heartbroken. "This is disgusting. She's just a child," one user wrote. "How can we let racism like this happen in 2025? Said another. Malcolm's phone rang non-stop as reporters sought his comments. He refused interviews, choosing instead to focus on his plan of action. This wasn't about sound bites or headlines. This was about justice. At the courthouse, Malcolm filed a formal complaint against Officer Johnson. With the help of his legal team, he meticulously documented everything: the arrest report, the video footage, and witness testimonies from the neighbors who had seen it happen. He also dug deeper into Johnson's record, and what he found only fueled his anger. Johnson had a history of complaints against him. Excessive force, racial profiling, verbal abuse. Most of the cases had been quietly dismissed or buried under paperwork. But Malcolm wasn't about to let that happen again. Meanwhile, protests erupted in Willow Creek. Dozens of community members gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read, "Justice for Aaliyah" and "End Police Racism Now." People chanted, "No justice, no peace," while others shared their own stories of racial profiling in the town. Inside the station, the mood was tense. Officers exchanged nervous glances as the protest grew louder. Even those who had turned a blind eye to Johnson's behavior began to question whether they'd been complicit in his actions. Officer Johnson, however, remained defiant. He paced in the break room, scoffing at the news coverage. "It's just a bunch of noise," he muttered to his partner. People love to play the victim, but deep down he was rattled. He hadn't expected the arrest to explode like this, and he certainly hadn't expected Judge Carter to fight back so publicly. Malcolm wasn't finished. That afternoon he stood on the steps of the courthouse, flanked by Aaliyah and his legal team. Cameras flashed as he stepped up to the microphone, his face resolute. "Yesterday, my 8-year-old daughter Aaliyah was arrested and humiliated by an officer who saw her not as a child, but as a threat," Malcolm began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is not just about my daughter. This is about every black child who has been targeted, every family that has been torn apart, and every person who has suffered because of systemic racism." He paused, looking directly into the cameras. "Officer Johnson abused his power, and we will hold him accountable. But let me be clear. This isn't just about one bad officer. It's about a system that allows people like him to act without fear of consequences. That ends now." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, but Malcolm wasn't done. "To those who think they can treat black children like they don't matter, let this be your warning. We will not stand by. We will fight, and we will win." As Malcolm stepped away from the podium, reporters shouted questions, but he ignored them. He knelt down beside Aaliyah, who was clutching his hand tightly. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked. She nodded, her eyes wide as she looked at the crowd. "Daddy, are they all here because of me?" He smiled softly. "They're here because of what happened to you, and they're here to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." The small face brightened with a hint of hope. "So, we're helping people?" Malcolm's chest swelled with pride. "Yes, baby, we are." Inside the police station, the pressure mounted. With the public demanding action, the police chief had no choice but to place Johnson on administrative leave, pending an investigation. Johnson's smirk faded as he was called into the chief's office. "This is all blown out of proportion," Johnson grumbled, slamming his badge on the desk. The chief shook his head. "You've been a problem for years, Johnson. This time you've gone too far. You think you're untouchable, but you're not." As Johnson stormed out of the office, the chief turned to his staff. "Start pulling everything we've got on him," he ordered. "If we don't clean this mess up, it's going to cost us all." Meanwhile, Malcolm was preparing for the next battle. He knew this wasn't just about getting Johnson fired. It was about dismantling the culture that allowed officers like him to thrive. He began organizing town hall meetings, inviting community members to share their experiences and push for change. The response was overwhelming. Story after story came pouring in. Black families harassed during traffic stops, teenagers followed in stores, neighbors watched with suspicion. Each story was a painful reminder of the work that needed to be done. "We need accountability," Malcolm said during one meeting. "Not just for Officer Johnson, but for the entire system that allowed him to act with impunity. It's time to demand better, for our children, for our community, and for ourselves." The room erupted in applause, and Malcolm knew they were on the brink of something big. Just as Malcolm began to feel the momentum of the movement, his phone buzzed with a text from his journalist friend. "You're going to want to see this. Check your email." Malcolm opened the email, his heart sinking as he watched the attached video. It wasn't just Johnson's actions on the day of Aaliyah's arrest. It was a compilation of incidents spanning years. Footage of Johnson berating black teens, manhandling a young man during a traffic stop, and sneering at a crying woman in handcuffs. The email ended with a single line. "How many more lives has this man ruined?" Malcolm clenched his fists. This was bigger than he thought. Malcolm stared at the video on his laptop, his mind reeling. The clips of Officer Johnson's behavior painted a damning picture. a man who had spent years abusing his power, targeting black residents, and walking away without consequences. Each scene in the video was worse than the last. A teenager slammed against a patrol car, a father handcuffed in front of his crying children, and a sobbing woman berated while pleading for help. The injustice wasn't new to Malcolm, but this footage was undeniable, unrelenting proof of a pattern. His first thought was of Aaliyah. How many others like her had been caught in Johnson's crosshairs, unable to defend themselves? How many families had suffered in silence? Malcolm took a deep breath, his determination hardening. This wasn't just about justice for Aaliyah anymore. It was about justice for every victim Officer Johnson had ever targeted. The next day, Malcolm called an emergency press conference. The courthouse steps were packed with reporters, activists, and concerned citizens, all eager to hear what he had to say. Malcolm stood before the cameras, the weight of the video footage hanging heavy on his shoulders. In the past 48 hours, Malcolm began, his voice steady but intense. New evidence has come to light about Officer Johnson. Evidence that reveals a history of systemic abuse, racial profiling, and outright disregard for the people he was sworn to protect. He paused, scanning the crowd. This isn't one bad officer having a bad day. This is a man who has terrorized this community for years, enabled by a system that looked the other way, and I'm here to tell you, no more. The crowd murmured as Malcolm gestured to a screen behind him, where clips of the video began to play. Gasps rippled through the audience as they watched Johnson's brutality on full display. Malcolm's voice broke through the murmurs. For too long, people like Officer Johnson have been allowed to abuse their power, shielded by silence and complacency. But today, we break that silence. Today, we say enough is enough. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, their anger and determination palpable. Inside the police station, the atmosphere was anything but celebratory. Officers gathered around TVs and laptops, watching the press conference in stunned silence. Some shook their heads, others looked down at their hands, shame etched into their faces. The police chief, pacing his office, let out a frustrated sigh. "This is a disaster," he muttered, slamming a file onto his desk. "How did we let it get this bad?" One of his deputies hesitated before speaking. "Chief, this isn't just Johnson. You know that, right? He's not the only one." The chief stopped in his tracks, his shoulders slumping. He knew it was true. Johnson was just the tip of the iceberg, the most visible symptom of a deeply rooted problem. But he also knew that fixing it would mean turning the department upside down. Meanwhile, Malcolm met with his legal team and community leaders to strategize. The video footage had sparked outrage, but outrage alone wasn't enough. They needed action. "We'll file a federal civil rights lawsuit," one of the lawyers suggested. "Good," Malcolm said, nodding. "And we need to push for criminal charges against Johnson. He needs to be held accountable, not just for Aaliyah, but for every person he's hurt." "And the department?" asked another leader. "What about the system that protected him?" Malcolm leaned forward, his voice firm. "We're going after them too. This isn't just about one cop. This is about dismantling the entire culture that allows racism and abuse to thrive." The group nodded in agreement, their resolve clear. The hands of Officer Johnson. Malcolm listened to each story, his heart breaking with every word. A mother whose son had been falsely accused of theft. A young man who was assaulted during a routine traffic stop. A family who moved out of Willow Creek after being targeted repeatedly. One woman, an elderly grandmother, approached Malcolm after a town hall meeting. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "He dragged my grandson out of his car last year," she said. "He said he fit the description. My grandson hasn't been the same since." Malcolm placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're going to make this right," he said softly. As the pressure mounted, Officer Johnson began to feel the walls closing in. His suspension turned into termination, and rumors of a criminal investigation swirled. His once smug demeanor had all but disappeared. In his small apartment, he paced back and forth, watching the news coverage with mounting panic. Clips of his past actions played on every channel, his name and face plastered across headlines. "Rogue cop exposed. The truth about Officer Johnson." He grabbed his phone and dialed his union representative, his voice shaking. "You need to fix this," he demanded. "There's nothing we can do, Johnson," the representative replied coldly. "You brought this on yourself." For the first time, Johnson realized he was truly alone. As Malcolm prepared for the next court hearing, his phone buzzed with another message. This time it was from a whistleblower inside the department. The message read, "It's worse than you think. Johnson wasn't acting alone. Call me." Malcolm's jaw tightened as he stared at the screen. This wasn't just about one officer. This was about a system that needed to be torn apart. And he was ready to do it. Malcolm stared at the whistleblower's message, his heart pounding. "It's worse than you think. Johnson wasn't acting alone. Call me." He immediately dialed the number, his mind racing with questions. A voice answered after the second ring, hushed and cautious. "Judge Carter." "Yes," Malcolm replied, his voice steady but urgent. "I received your message." "What do you mean Johnson wasn't acting alone?" The whistleblower hesitated. "I can't talk over the phone. There's too much to explain. Meet me tonight, 9 p.m., at the diner on Main Street. And come alone." That night, Malcolm sat in a dimly lit booth at the back of the diner, his eyes scanning the room. The whistleblower arrived a few minutes late, a young officer, barely in his 30s, with tired eyes and a nervous energy. "I don't have much time," the officer whispered as he slid into the seat across from Malcolm. "If anyone finds out I'm here, I'll lose my job, or worse." "You're safe here," Malcolm assured him. "But if you have information, now's the time to share it. What are we really dealing with?" The officer took a deep breath. "Johnson's just one piece of it. There's a group of officers in the department, higher-ups included, who've been covering for each other for years. Racism, brutality, falsifying reports. It's all connected. They think they're untouchable because they've buried every complaint. Internal Affairs doesn't even bother investigating anymore." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "You're telling me this is an organized system of corruption?" "Yes," the officer said grimly. "And it's worse than what you've already seen. There are records, body cam footage, and internal memos that prove it, but no one in the department will let those files see the light of day." "Do you have access to the files?" Malcolm asked. The officer nodded. "I can get them. But if I'm caught, they'll come after me. These people don't play fair, Judge. They'll destroy anyone who threatens them." Malcolm leaned forward, his voice low and firm. "If you bring me those files, I'll make sure you're protected. You're doing the right thing, not just for my daughter, but for every family that's suffered because of this corruption." The officer hesitated, then nodded. "I'll get you what you need." 2 days later, Malcolm received an encrypted email. Attached were dozens of files. Incident reports that had been altered, body cam footage showing unprovoked violence, and emails between officers mocking victims and boasting about their power over the community. Malcolm's stomach turned as he scrolled through the evidence. It wasn't just Johnson. This was an entrenched culture of abuse, with officers protecting each other at the expense of the people they were sworn to serve. He immediately forwarded the files to his legal team and his journalist contact. "This is it," he told them. "This isn't just a local case anymore. This is a national scandal." The next morning, major news outlets picked up the story. "Systemic racism exposed. Willow Creek Police Department under fire," dominated headlines across the country. Footage of officers laughing about false arrests and brutalizing civilians played on screens nationwide. Protesters flooded the streets of Willow Creek, their numbers growing by the hour. The DOJ announced an immediate federal investigation into the department, while politicians publicly condemned the actions of the officers involved. Malcolm's phone rang non-stop, reporters begging for interviews, and activists asking how they could support the cause. Inside the police station, chaos erupted. Officers scrambled to delete files and cover their tracks, but it was too late. The whistleblower's evidence had exposed everything. Officer Johnson sat in an interrogation room, his head in his hands. His attorney whispered furiously in his ear, but Johnson looked defeated. Across the table, federal investigators laid out the charges: civil rights violations, falsifying reports, and conspiracy. "You're looking at decades in prison, Johnson," one investigator said coldly, "unless you cooperate and give us the names of everyone involved." Back at home, Malcolm sat on the couch with Aaliyah, holding her close as they watched the evening news. Clips of the protests filled the screen, with signs reading, "Justice for Aaliyah and end racism in policing." "Is it over, Daddy?" Aaliyah asked quietly. Malcolm kissed the top of her head. "Not yet, baby. But we're getting closer. And because of you, people are finally paying attention." She looked up at him with wide eyes. I didn't do anything, though. Yes, you did, Malcolm said, his voice thick with emotion. You showed the world what it means to be brave. And because of you, they'll think twice before doing this to another little girl. In the months that followed, sweeping reforms transformed the Willow Creek Police Department. Officers implicated in the corruption were fired and faced criminal charges. New leadership prioritized community trust, implementing mandatory bias training and body cam accountability measures. Malcolm continued to advocate for systemic change, speaking at events across the country. Though the fight was far from over, he knew they had taken a powerful first step, and through it all, Aaliyah stayed by his side, a quiet reminder of why this fight mattered. One evening, months after the scandal, Aaliyah sat at the kitchen table, drawing with crayons. She held up a picture of her father wearing a superhero cape. "What's this?" Malcolm asked, smiling. "You're a superhero, Daddy," she said proudly. "You saved me." Malcolm's throat tightened as he looked at the drawing. "No, sweetheart," he said softly. "You saved me. You reminded me why we fight. For you, for us, and for everyone." As he hugged her tightly, Malcolm felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just his fight. It was a fight for justice, for equality, and for a future where no child would ever have to go through what Aaliyah had.